Welcome everybody to Chevalier's Books online, I guess. We're the oldest bookstore in Los Angeles, been in business since 1940. As you will hear, we were in business before some of the events about which we'll be speaking tonight occurred. We are twice blessed to have two fantastic achievers, credentialed European historians who teach in endowed chairs at the Claremont McKenna College and are visiting at Yale now. Wendy Lower is the Roth professor at CMC. She was a runner-up for the National Book Award for her famous book, Hitler's Furies. I know a couple of people who are on today are themselves Holocaust students and no doubt have read that book. Her amazing, incredible book about which she will be speaking begins with a photograph and asks the important question of who are these people? It is a smoking gun photograph, literally, of the assassination of a family in Ukraine. We will learn through her incredible, meticulous study who the victims were, who the killers were, and for me, incredibly interestingly, who the photographer was. The book talks about restoring victims as subjects and not objects of history. And it also focuses so much upon why a photographer would take these pictures. I won't spoil the ending because this is a book you must read, and it is a super fast read because you can't wait to get to the next part of it. It is the product of decades of meticulous research, investigation, interviews, the kind of thing that can only make you admire and wish that you were a historian. So Wendy will be talking about her book, The Ravine, which she reminds me was reviewed in yesterday's New York Times. And my friend, John Petropoulos, who is the Crowell Professor of European History at Claremont McKenna, is responsible for one of my great moments as a lawyer when together we stood in a museum in Madrid, and he brought his expertise to bear upon a Pissarro picture which was looted by the Nazis from clients of ours at the time, and in a moment-by-moment and dramatic way, identified the markings in the back of the picture, which allowed the tracing of the provenance of this thing from Berlin to Madrid, through France, through parts unknown in the world. He's written a captivating biography of a horrid human being. I can't wait to find out more about what it was like to have interviewed him for perhaps a decade. Bruno Lohse. Lohse was a Nazi art plunderer, and he did his most important work during the war for Hermann Goering. For many people, one of our best-selling books at Chevalier's is The Splendid and the Vile. And I thought it would be assist in understanding Lohse if I just read a little bit about Hermann Goering, who was functionally the #2 person under Hitler and who was the head of the Luftwaffe. Eric Larson, in his book, describes Goering as having had a passion for extravagant sartorial display. He designed his own uniforms, the flashier the better, medals, epaulets, silver filigree, changing clothes multiple times in the course of a day, known to wear more eccentric costumes as well, tunics, togas, sandals, which he accented by painting his toenails red and applying makeup to his cheeks. To be the art dealer for Hermann Goering was something that in and of itself would have been a great story and could have ended. But the story of Lohse after the war, when he continued to be an art plunderer and an art dealer, including a relationship he developed with a senior curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who was himself a monuments man. I just watched that movie again the other night to sort of get myself ready for this. The monuments men were, as you'll recall, in this case, the George Clooney case, American soldiers recovering plundered art. And this very, very powerful, important person at the Metropolitan Museum of Art who dealt with Lohse, as you'll hear, I hope, was himself a monuments man. So the story of Bruno Lohse is one that continued from before the war, through the war, after the war, through denazification, and it has been, I think, an extraordinary commitment by Professor Petropoulos to follow this decades-long story and be able to tell us a little bit about him tonight. So without further ado, as they say, I will turn it over to our wonderful guests, and I can't wait to see how this goes. So thanks a lot for being here. It really means a lot.
Thank you, Bert. We appreciate that generous introduction. And we were just talking beforehand, Bert and I, and the picture that we worked on, oops, to go back, the Pissarro is actually in the cover of my book here. This is the actual Camille Pissarro, the looted picture that the press, that Yale University Press, happened to select. So it was a meaningful photograph for the both of us. So Wendy and I are so delighted to be with you all. This is the first time we have actually presented our books together, even though they came out around the same time. Mine was released January 26th, so it's about 2 weeks old, and Wendy's came out earlier this week. So they're still freshly baked. And I said, we're colleagues together at CMC, and we're here at Yale together on sabbatical right now, and we're even talking about our next book, writing it together. So we're going to take turns and try to play nicely together. We're going to first offer overviews of our books and then focus in on some other issues. So the first section is the longest. We're going to finish up in an hour. But I just wanted to provide the
total program in an hour. But this first section's only like 10 minutes.
Exactly. And so I wanted to provide some context for this book. I've been studying Nazi art looting and Allied restitution for over 37 years now. I began this work as a graduate student at Harvard in 1983, and I was just fascinated by this nexus of culture and barbarism. And I'm going to go very, very quickly here. My doctoral dissertation and first book was about the art collections of the Nazi leaders. And I knew that Hitler had a great art collection, the Führer Museum. Here we see Himmler giving him a picture, but I didn't realize that the other Nazi leaders had such massive collections. And this is Goering on the left here in the Jeu de Paume, looking at a looted picture here. And what I did in my dissertation was I reconstructed collections for about 15 Nazi leaders. And it wasn't just Hitler and Goering and Himmler at the top. It was other leaders like Robert Lai. They all had art collections that today are worth millions of dollars, right? It was the hobby or the practice that was in vogue was to collect art. And that's what interested me. So after reconstructing the collections, I tried to analyze what this behavior told us about the Nazis, and I divided it into different categories. One was ideological, about how the collecting expressed their ideological orientation. Another was more sociological. The Nazis used art as props, and they tried to create these theater sets and integrate with the traditional feudal aristocracy. And so art was a tool in that project. And the third area I looked at was more anthropological, is this culture of gift giving that developed. And art was the preferred gift. And here we see Hitler giving Goering a painting. Goering was an avid hunter. So this is a picture of a woman hunting with a falcon. Usually the paintings had some kind of meaning or significance that I analyzed. So I started off with my first project with the Nazi leaders. And that led me pretty quickly to the second rank figures, people very much like Wendy and myself who were professionals, academics and that, and how they had contributed to the Nazis' art plundering program. And one person I looked at was Kajetan Mühlmann here on the right. He's the greatest art plunderer of all time, right? Mühlmann plundered in Vienna after the Anschluss in 1938. He went to Poland in September 39 and helped clean out Poland. Then he went to the Netherlands. I mean, no one in all of history has rivaled Mühlmann. And so I wanted to write the history of the actual plunderers. He was an art historian, a PhD in art history. And you know, what did he do? What was his role? And I apologize for this image, but it is the topic this evening. In the early 1990s, our generations of scholars changed the focus from the top leaders, Hitler and Goering, to second rank figures. And this is when we really started to study the perpetrators, like the Einsatz group. And in this famous photo from Vinnytsia, Ukraine, not far from where Wendy's photo was taken, scholars have identified over 10 different uniforms of people in the background. So we realized it wasn't just the SS who was doing the killing. There was the Wehrmacht, it was a Hitler Youth, it was a labor corps. And we really started to understand the second rank. And so I was trying to do that for the art plunderers, right? And this to me has always seemed like a metaphor for what I've done. It's Mühlmann's SS file. It's been burned and there's water damage, right? I found it in the Federal Archives in Berlin. But it's, you know, we get a picture of these people, but there are still spots, there's still pieces of the puzzle that are missing, right? And so many of them. And with Faustian Bargain, of all the figures I wrote about, I never wrote a chapter longer than 30 pages. I could not find more material about Mühlmann to extend beyond 30 pages. So what I've been able to do with Bruno Lohse is a different kind of project because it's much more up close and personal, much more in depth. But what I learned when writing Faustian Bargain is it's really hard to find out what happened to the plunderers after the war, or more specifically after 1950. They went through some measure of justice between 1945 and 1950, denazification, and there are files relating to that process. But once they got out in 1950, the archives are silent. So what do you do, right? So what I started to do was I went to a lot of cemeteries. And you know, I've been doing this for a long time because my hair is black. And I had my Nazi hunting dog, my Vizsla there, and we go look for old Nazis and figure out where they, and this is, you know, I was looking for Mühlmann in the cemetery and I found his grave, Kajetan Mühlmann in Salzburg. He had died in 1958. And I used the grave marker to lead to his widow, who lived in this beautiful villa on the Attersee in the Austrian Alps. This was one of the places that Gustav Klimt painted very frequently. And she is actually in the doorway, just shutting it as I took the photo. She wouldn't let me take any photos, but she let me climb up into the attic and I found photos of her deceased husband up there, right? So this is what I got used to doing, was talking to people and climbing into attics and doing whatever. But I realized in the late 90s and early 2000 that these old Nazis were still alive, still around, that they would be willing to talk to me. I'm a professor, I speak German, I'm not Jewish, unfortunately. So they, you know, they sometimes asked, and I started to go around and one person led to another. I went and interviewed Wilhelm Hüttel a couple times. He was an SS general, one of the major perpetrators in Budapest, working with Adolf Eichmann during the war. And this is the second time I saw Hüttel there too. And so I started to interview them. And Hüttel led me to Bruno Lohse, and he was the jewel of the crown, if you will, for me, right? Such an important plunderer who is still alive. Again, Mühlmann had died so many years earlier. Lohse was a Berlin art dealer. You see him here in the 30s. He lived until 2007, and I met him in 1998. I'll talk more about that at the end. He was also a member of the SS, a terrifying individual, 6'4". When I met him, he was about 285 pounds. At the end of his life, he weighed 350 pounds. He was massive, the biggest hands I'd ever seen. I later found a document where he had boasted to someone that he had killed Jews with his own hands. I could actually believe it when I saw the size of those hands. So Lohse had been in the Polish campaign, the campaign in Poland in September 39, and he was getting ready to be transferred to go fight in the Soviet Union in early 41. He was there, and he had an offer to be transferred to Paris to help Hermann Goering with his art collecting activities. And he went to Paris and he loved the work. It was far better than being on the Eastern Front. He developed a connection with Goering. Lohse organized 19 exhibitions of looted art in the Jeu de Paume, the headquarters of the ERR, or the Einsatzstab Reichswehr Rosenberg. And so this was one of the foundations for the relationship, that Lohse would prepare these exhibitions of looted art and Goering would choose them. But it developed from there, right? And so you get a sense of what this young PhD in art history is doing with the second most powerful man in the Third Reich at that time, right? And of course, Goering was building a massive art collection divided between 4 different residences. This is the one in Karenhall outside of Berlin. Many of the pictures that Lohse showed Goering were not suitable for Goering. For example, the Matisses here, that you can see them actually laughing at the modern art. It was kind of, their expressions is interesting. This gave Lohse, I believe, an opportunity to embezzle, to enrich himself, because if Goering wasn't concerned about this Matisses, there was an opportunity for Lohse. And as we'll see, he ended up as a very wealthy man at the end of his life. The Nazis sequestered the modern art, the Room of Martyrs, as you can read in the Jeu de Paume, but this was trading fair, and Lohse would trade it away and do deals and all this, right? So my book is, the first half of it is really a careful portrait of an art plunder in Paris, right? Up close and personal. It's not 30 pages. It's much more developed, and you see what it was like. And when you see the details, it's really, look, even this picture of frames, these are all empty frames. The pictures have been stolen. I find this very moving, very, very touching there. Well, at war's end, Lohse helped oversee the safeguarding of the works they had stolen. There were about 21,000 stolen artworks, things taken from French Jews in Neuschwanstein, another 10,000 that Lohse and his crew had stolen in Paris that were in other repositories. And Lohse, at war's end, went with the art to Neuschwanstein, helped safeguard it. He was arrested there by James Rorimer, who became very famous. He became the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1954, the first Jewish director of the Met, by the way. Matt Damon plays him in the movie, though, when he's a monuments man. So he arrested Lohse at Neuschwanstein, and that's part of the connection. Lohse and the other plunderers were then sent to a house in the Austrian Alps in Attersee, which was a site of a salt mine where the Nazis stored a lot of the looted art. And about 15 of these plunderers were kept in the summer of 45 in House 71 in Alpsee and interrogated. And one of the people who interrogated Lohse was Theodore Rousseau, Ted Rousseau, this dashing, cosmopolitan, multilingual monumentsman curator. And he not only became the chief curator of European paintings of the Met, he was the deputy director under Tom Hoving, right? The number 2 person of the Met. Incredibly successful career. And they formed a friendship when Rousseau and the other monuments officers were interrogating Lohse. The Americans passed Lohse over to the French in 1946, and he sat in a jail in Paris in Cherche-Midi for 3 years until the trial in 1950. Rousseau and the other monuments officer helped Lohse with documents during the trial. And Lohse was, astonishingly enough, he was acquitted, and this is his paper where he was actually acquitted by the Paris Military Tribunal, extraordinary, and he was able to go back into business, right? And so here's his card from 1959 with a little coffee spilled on it. He called himself an art historian, and he kind of stayed in the shadows. This was his home, a rather modest apartment on the top floor in a beautiful neighborhood of Munich in Bogenhausen. It contained about $5 million, $10 million worth of art in there, but it was a modest apartment. He was staying under the radar, but he was definitely a known dealer in the 60s and stuff. This is from the Bavarian state painting collections, and you can see there's a Murillo that's being offered for 1.5 million Deutschmarks, and it's being offered by Dr. Lohse in Munich, right? So he was a player. I went around all the archives in Munich and Germany, and I find evidence of him. This is a colleague, and these are all the things that Lohse bought from the colleague Boehler. It's hard to read, but he's buying things, right? What was so interesting for me, it wasn't just Lohse who rehabilitated his career, revived his career. It was the other Nazi art plunders. Lohse's great rival, Walter Andreas Hofer, right? Hofer was the director of Göring's collection. Lohse was Göring's guy in Paris. Lohse wanted Hofer's job. Well, Hofer was back in business in the 1970s, right? 66, this one is, 66 and 70s, right? This is an art magazine. He's offering this picture. Another dealer who was prominent, actually the most important dealer in Germany at the time, Karl Haberstock, he was in Berlin. He moved to Munich, like Lohse, who had been a Berliner, moved to like Hofer. They all moved to Munich. Berlin is bombed into moonscape. It's an island in the Red Sea surrounded by East Germany. So they moved to Munich, and this is the center of the network. In fact, Haberstock and Hofer live in the same building. Haberstock's here and Hofer's there, and Lohse would call it the Brown House, a joke that it was a Nazi house there. Anyways, Haberstock gave his art collection to his hometown in Augsburg, and they even named a street after him, still named after him, right? So a notorious notorious Nazi art dealer, they're still putting up street signs and honoring him, right? And so that's the world I walked into, and it's, look, there's this network based in Munich. It's really important. You may have heard of the Görlich cache, about 1,600 pictures worth over $1 billion. He was in Munich, or his father, and then he was in Munich too. That's their part of the network as well. But the network expanded out, right? Very much so. And it went to America. Ted Rousseau, as a curator, I was astonished to find this when I was doing research. And in his papers, which were finally cataloged, you can see there's correspondence with Lohse. This is 2 of these boxes. And there are about 60, 70 letters between the two. I think there's even more correspondence that has been sanitized. And Rousseau was writing to Lohse saying, I'm going to come see you in Germany. And Lohse is just popping by the Met to see his friend Rousseau there, right? So this very interesting relationship between Rousseau. I know Rousseau was using Lohse for information. Was he also buying pictures from Lohse? It's hard to prove, right? But Rousseau knew what he was dealing with, right? He was a monuments man who had studied Nazi art looting. It was still in the news. 1964, the cover of the New York Times is still writing about Nazi looted art. You cannot say they didn't know about this. He absolutely knew. But Lohse was impressive at this time in the 70s and 80s, right? He was suave and dignified, and he came to New York and he stayed in the fanciest hotels, and it was a show. And so this relationship is interesting. And even perhaps more interesting relationship is between Lohse and the Wildensteins, because Lohse helped steal the art of the French Jewish art dealing dynasty during the war, and then he became an agent for the Wildensteins. And this is very sensitive, and I'm very, very careful, but it really appears to be the case. The Wildensteins are written about a great deal. Oftentimes they're associated with scandal and what have you, but they are the most important art dealers in the second half of the 20th century, right? The Duvines for the first half, of the Wildensteins, they're very private. They would not speak to me. I wrote to them several times, but it's a pretty compelling story there. So Lohse, he revived his career. He was selling pictures like these 2 Dürers that are in the German Historical Museum. When he died in 2007, he had 40 pictures. And some of them were, and I'll talk about later, in a Swiss bank vault. Some of them were his Munich apartment. But these 40 pictures were by Renoir and Monet and Van Gogh. You know, they were worth tens of millions of dollars. How did he get so wealthy, right? So that's a big part of my story, is explaining, it really is, it balances the story. It's not just the wartime years, it's the post-war years. And that's the part of the story I think was missing in the other studies, the post-war years. And that's one of the things I was able to get. So that's my initial foray. And I'll leave it to you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. It was very, very compact. So we're going to switch gears now, because this is a twofer. You get 2 books tonight at this event. My name is Wendy Lauer, and thank you, Bert, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Chevalier Books, for having us here tonight, and all of you for joining us. I wrote a book on 1 photograph, so it's a much more focused study. It's a smaller book than Jonathan's, and very specific theme of atrocity photography and the Holocaust, and questions as to what can be displayed or what should be displayed. But more than anything, the question as to what can be found out about a single photograph, and kind of the challenge of trying to tell a history based on very few sources. And my focus is Ukraine. I've been working on Ukraine since 1992, so shortly after Ukraine declared its independence in August 91. I've been doing field work there. And that's a part of my story, actually, is going back to Ukraine and trying to piece together the story around this one singular rare photograph. So I want to show you the photograph. It's rather shocking and disturbing, but this is the nature of this endeavor. And after I tell my story tonight, I hope you'll agree with me that it was worth the effort, worth the research. In 2009, I was in the Holocaust Museum archives, and 2 journalists came in from Prague, and they found this photograph in what was the former KGB-like authority in Prague, and they didn't know what to make of it. I happened to be in the archives that day working on another project, and because my colleagues knew I worked on Ukraine and worked on this particular region of Ukraine, they brought the photograph to my attention and asked me, what do you think of this? This book, by the way, is also one of the intentions, there are many behind it, actually driving motivations behind it, but one of them is to actually share with audiences the extent to which Holocaust studies as a research field has developed over the decades and in so many different interdisciplinary kinds of approaches. And so each chapter of this book looks at this photograph as a way of trying to kind of put to the test the ways that we do research, whether we're using documents, going out into the field and interviewing witnesses, going to the crime scenes, looking at this photography here, obviously, Nazi documentation, testimony, and forensic types of investigations on the ground. So I just want to show you, walk you through the book a little bit in the way that I analyze the photograph. The book is it's not a long book. It's about, Bert was talking about it too. It's about a 180 page read. And I did that deliberately because a good part of the book is actually the footnotes in the back. They won't interfere with your reading experience. But there are a lot of, in the Herodotan tradition of history, a lot of these kind of digressions, but also stories in those footnotes, things that I pulled out because I really was hoping that the reader could experience this photo and this history in almost, in one sitting and walk with me on this journey of trying to figure out who is in this photo, what happened, who are the people in it, and what were their fates. Some of the things that were really striking to me in this photograph as I first looked at it were these shoes in the foreground here, these empty shoes, and the question of, who was here, who came before the family, the women and children that are pictured there, who these shoes belong to, and there's some papers there. And if you really zoom in and zoom out, and this entire book is about zooming in and zooming out in many ways, the micro history and the kind of the macro context. As you look at this picture, actually, you'll see bullet casings on the ground next to these shoes, which is really kind of the litter of mass murder. I was struck by, this is broad daylight. Here is the landscape, these blotchy trees in the background, and the fact that these massacres in Ukraine, the so-called Holocaust by bullets, if you're familiar with Father Desbois' work and some of the recent research, these killings are done in broad daylight in these small communities. For some of you who don't know, every fourth victim who was murdered in the Holocaust died in what is Ukraine today, the borders of Ukraine today. And about 1 million victims of the Holocaust who have not been identified are mostly from Ukraine, and they're mostly children. Because when the Nazis drove these communities, these small communities, these shtetls, what was the terrain of the former Pale of Settlement, where the Jews were forced to reside during the Tsarist Empire for centuries. When the Germans swept into this region in 1941 and carried out these mass shootings, they didn't bother to list and register. I mean, there was no deportation. They were marched out of town, very little documentation on what happened. So we're incredibly have to rely on these very scarce sources. At first, when I saw this picture, I thought it was a ravine. The title of the book is The Ravine. The Nazis put nature to work when they carried out their massacres. They used the local, they used the terrain, they used the gullies, they used the rivers, they used the ravines like Babi Yar outside of Kiev. But I would find out in the course of my research that this actually had been dug, because when I went to Mariupol, this is the location of this photo, Mariupol, Ukraine. It was taken on October 13th, 1941. When I went back there in 2016, I discovered that, in fact, it was the exact location, that it was not a ravine. It was these pits that had been dug. And I met one of the women, now women, but who was a girl at the time, and forced to actually dig this pit during this shooting action. Also struck by these killers. Now here we have 2 Germans, 2 Ukrainians, a Ukrainian onlooker, the man in the cap. And what's striking is that these killers are like shoulder to shoulder in kind of a gang formation, and they don't speak each other's language. These are local Ukrainians who knew the Jewish victims in the photo. These are 2 Germans who kind of swept through into this town, came into this town, didn't know anyone in this town, didn't speak Ukrainian or Russian, and yet they are participating in this action together. It is a startling, stark example of collaboration. Here we see I interviewed people who worked in ballistics. You can see the smoke, the halo of smoke above this woman's head. You can see the children. She's holding the one little boy's hand. He's barefooted. She's there in her polka dotted dress with her Mary Jane shoes. And as I mentioned before, we don't know about the person who wore this coat and who wore these shoes. These Ukrainians right here, on the topic of collaboration, it's indisputable here that this gentleman is actually shooting. I mean, you can see the expression of his face. There's a grimace. You can see the posture. Again, I met with some people, ballistics people, various officials, FBI. They're talking me through, helping me understand exactly what's going on and what's possible in terms of the positions of these figures, and why the smoke is in this formation here is because this is from victims that have been brought before, and this is the smoke that is just hanging in the atmosphere. So this is not from these victims, but from the prior victims. And indeed, several hundred people, several hundred Jews, mostly what was left of the families, were killed on that day in this public park in Mariupol, October 13th, 1941, as I mentioned. These Ukrainians here are locals who were given these Red Army coats and these armbands. They, let me go to the next picture here. Whoops, that's your picture. Sorry. Sorry, I'm doing this PowerPoint together. I don't know if, do I have time to go into the discoveries right now? Because I'm looking at the clock.
We're going to discover.
Sorry?
Keep going, it's phenomenal. We're loving it.
Okay. I guess at this point, what I wanted to say is I want to kind of jump a little bit into some of. Do
you want your?
No, that's okay. I'm just going to show them on the photo. It's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I want to mention that the photograph that was brought from Prague was, thank you, was brought because it was the reason why it was in Prague was because the photographer, his name was Lubomir Skrovina. He's Slovakian. Okay. So we have a Slovakian photographer taking a picture at close range. We have two Ukrainians shoulder to shoulder with Germans. So it's absolutely important for the history of collaboration. This Slovakian Guard is part of the units that were brought in during Operation Barbarossa of collaborating kind of security units. So why was he there? Why did he take the picture? Well, first of all, the photo is taken in the open. It's not secret. It's not clandestine. You can see it's a stable picture. He's got an eye for photography. It's following kind of an aesthetic, as horrific as it is. This kind of rule of thirds here. It's a stable picture, right? But what I found out was this photographer was in no way complicit. I thought that he was one of the collaborators, when in fact, this was his moment of his, what we would say kind of his enough moment. And he took this picture, and now John is going to run up. Thank you, there he is. He's a nice looking young man. This was taken after the war, actually, the photographer. So he's a young man. He's been forced into this military service. He doesn't even want to wear a uniform. I met with his family and interviewed them, and they showed me a lot of his personal papers. This was not his personality whatsoever. He was not an anti-Semite. On the contrary, he took these photos, brought them back to Bratislava, and then embarked in an entire resistance campaign. He and his wife. He was able to get out of military service. He faked that he was ill. He started to show these pictures to Jews in Bratislava and Banska Bystrica. He hid a Jewish family in his attic, including an obstetrician who delivered his son in 1943. So it's a story in many ways about a really horrible photograph. We think we know what there is, to know on first glance when we look at it, but that's not actually what happened. It's much a story about resistance as it is in a horrific document of genocide in its most extreme form, which I argue in the book is fundamentally targeting families. This is something that Hitler said in the summer of 1941, really close to when this photograph was taken, and the Holocaust was fully underway as far as the killing phase in the mass shootings, shortly preceding the beginning of the construction of the gassing facilities. And Hitler said to his Croatian ally, there should be no Jewish family left in Europe at the end of this war. The final solution is about destroying every Jewish family. No children should live to rise up and avenge the murder of their parents. That is this is his thinking. This is what happened, going back to the 15th century with the expulsion of Jews. They always come back, he said. This is our chance to absolutely eliminate this race from Europe. So a big part of my book is also about the fate of families and the family in Nazi genocidal thinking. And that brought me to the endeavor of identifying the victims in the center of the photo, the families. And I could not determine with 100% certainty that this is the family. It really is a needle in a haystack. I mean, if you have, 1,000 Jews were killed in Mariupol. I had names amounting to 400, about 450. So I already was starting with a situation in which the odds were, 50-50. But really, it's just unbelievable that when I was at Yad Vashem and I found, I brought this photo in, and here was this singular page of testimony in which this woman from Southfield, Michigan, reported that she had distant cousins who were killed in the public park in Mariupol in 1941, and attached this photo. And this is rare that photos are attached. And this is a photo from 1941. And this is important to me because this is a family photo of what was left of this Jewish community in Mariupol. And they're showing us how they want to be photographed. Not the photograph that I showed you in the beginning, but this is what they want, how they want to be pictured. So this is very important for me. Whether or not I got the perfect match, the ID, to me doesn't matter. It's important to show this photo. But it is striking that this little boy and this is also a little boy and this woman. And I mean, if we could go back to the picture very quickly, so you can see that this age of this little boy is pretty close. And you can't see at first glance. Again, it's about really studying these over time with a lot of documentation to back it up. This here is another child. And you can see this. I realized in my analysis that this woman was standing in a certain position, a perpendicular position. She was actually shielding another child. So the research, yielded the discovery of yet another soul that would not have been visible if I hadn't really studied it and used different technology to kind of bring that into sharper relief.
All right.
So,
No,
you got yours.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
All right. So our second category, after introducing our book, we were going to talk about our fascinating finds, what it was about our books that we thought was surprising or intriguing. And for me, I mean, I think every author thinks there's a whole number of these, interesting elements of their book. But for me, I think, what stands out was the role of Liechtenstein in the art trade in the post-1950 world. And I went to Liechtenstein. And I knew, and we knew collectively about Swiss banks, right? We knew that they had a culture of banking secrecy with numbered bank accounts. We know that there are bank vaults. They say that the Bahnhofstrasse in Zurich has more wealth below ground than any city in the world above ground, right? Because it's just all banks and vaults down below that too. So we kind of knew about Swiss banks and that. But going back to this picture I showed you here, Liechtenstein, how does that fit in? And with Lohse, he did have a vault in the Zurich Cantonal Bank. When he died, there were 12 pictures there, including a looted Camille Pissarro. Pissarro, a French Jewish impressionist, was often collected by European Jews. And when the Nazis went out and plundered, many European Jews lost their Pissarro. So this was another looted Pissarro that was in the vault. But I didn't realize how Liechtenstein was going to play a role there. That Liechtenstein, after World War II, started setting up these foundations, and they're tax exempt, they're secretive, they have financial structures so that they don't cost the holder any money over time, that there's no payment. So basically the people in Liechtenstein, there are 36,000 people who live in Liechtenstein, they run foundations. So Bruno Lohse had a foundation. It was set up by his attorney, Friedrich Schöne, and the attorney called it Schön art, right? First part of his name in art. And Schöni was the one who sold the looted Passaro to, well, Lohse pretended to sell it to Schöni. They were partners together, Schöni and Lohse. But Schöni created this foundation in Liechtenstein that held Lohse's assets. So he had the Swiss bank vault there too, and he had the Liechtenstein Foundation, and that's where he held all his assets. And when I went to the headquarters that I showed you before, it's not in the picture, but like every house in Liechtenstein at the time, it had for each house at least 10 mailboxes, right? And sometimes there would be 30 or 40 mailboxes because each foundation had its own mailbox. And you'd watch this scam before your eyes, right? And they've clamped down on this a little bit, Liechtenstein, but it was just amazing. And the Friedrich Schöni, when I realized he's a Zurich lawyer helping, and he's Lohse's guy, he became a key to this whole discovery too with the Wildensteins, because Friedrich Schöni, and we see his name down here, was also the Wildenstein's lawyer in Switzerland. So what's he doing here in 1954? He's selling, he's transporting 3 Gauguins, 2 Cézannes, a Monet, a Sisley, a Picasso, 15 pictures. Well, Schöni is sending hundreds of pictures for the Wildensteins, thousands of pictures, right? Industrial strength pictures that he's sending via Liechtenstein and Switzerland to the United States, to America. And so here we really see how the dealers use the Swiss banks and the Liechtenstein foundations to their advantage. So I thought that was really interesting in this way, this tie to Schöni. And by the way, one of the Wildensteins did write me. I did get, well, didn't write me, but wrote to someone else, and I got a copy of the letter when Lohse died. And he says, I've known Bruno Lohse for more than 60 years, and he was always a good friend. Well, 60 years before 2007, it's clear that Lohse and the Wildensteins knew each other and were doing this business through Liechtenstein and in Switzerland. I mean, that's what the evidence is very suggestive of, right? So again, we knew about Lohse's bank vault, but the Liechtenstein element I find is interesting. My second fascinating element concerns Max Beckmann, who I would say is my favorite artist, the German New Objectivity artist and expressionist. He actually painted Lohse during the war, and this is Lohse. And Beckmann's best friend, Max Beckmann, was in the Netherlands, was a person named Erhard Goeppel, who was an art dealer, who was an agent for Hitler, was also an art plunderer. And Beckmann did a picture of his friend Goeppel with a sword and Lohse. And we have these dark nights with bombs behind them, right? This person we've been able to identify is the head of the French Gestapo. He's a gangster who worked with the French Gestapo, Pierre Bonny, and Lohse would use Bonny to raid apartments there too. And so you have this horizontal collaboration going on, and I just found it extraordinary. It's in Stuttgart, this picture, but Beckmann engaged the themes of culture and barbarism in his art, and I guess it makes sense that Lohse is about culture and barbarism too. But just to think, I thought this might be a good cover illustration for my book. Again, people wouldn't realize, but it's so sinister there too. So those are my two little discoveries that I thought were surprising and extraordinary. Yeah. So you had your camera from your
I know there's
and
I just wanted to not only just mention that not only was I able to track down the story of the photographer, which was really surprising, it was more challenging to identify specifically the names of the victims, which I thought I was going to be able to do in this culture of identifying victims and reading out their names, memorial services. The impression is that we have all these names, but we don't. And the camera, there's the camera that the photographer used to take this picture. And that was key piece of evidence because that day he put in his film 7, he could take 7 pictures, and I found 5. I ultimately went back to the Prague archive and found 4 additional ones. And the photographs that he took that day are a visual testimony. They are sequential. They show us step by step what was happening. And that's his testimony of what happened. And then clearly this is what he's using to launch his resistance effort. So I was surprised by the photographer and his biography and his mission and his reaction to all of this. I was also surprised by the fact that the Ukrainians, those 2 Ukrainians in the woolen coats, were actually tracked down by the KGB and their justice was served. The Germans were not prosecuted. They were questioned and they lied up and down because none of the investigators had that photo that we looked at. So if that photo had come out of the Prague archive, maybe those Germans would have been convicted, right? And the photo didn't exist as well when they prosecuted and investigated the Ukrainians. So the 2 Ukrainians that are in the photo were actually sentenced to death and executed by firing squad in January 1987. And if you know your history, you know that's very close to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the independence of Ukraine in August 91. So this is a very late trial in the history of these cases, and that's also a very interesting part of the story because it comes so close to when I actually visited when I got there the first time in the region in 1992. And many of the people I witnessed in Ukraine had incredibly detailed stories about these killers, about their Ukrainian neighbors. And when we went to the crime scene itself, we actually discovered the remains from this massacre. We held their bones in our hands, actually. So that's also part of the story. At the end of the book, I'm going to do this backwards now because we're going to wrap up. I focus on the shoes. And I just wanted to read in like 1 minute, because I know it's late, just a few words from the epilogue. It's an intense read because it's a really horrific, haunting photo. And I think the shoes are very kind of a metaphor for what I call the missing. The empty shoes and the crumpled coat exist there as questions, as gaps in knowledge. They remind us of victims whom we cannot see, the many who were murdered and remained missing. Like flawed testimonies and memories, photographs can mislead because they can never completely capture the reality of the event pictured or those involved. The Jewish man who was murdered, perhaps with his family, is not there, although his empty shoes and crumpled coat remain. We cannot see beyond the frame of the image. We cannot turn 360 degrees to take in the entire scene of the victims waiting to be killed. Other possible onlookers, including our Slovakian photographer and his comrades, and more German officials. The papers strewn amid the bullet casings at the end of this mass grave could be German lists or Jewish identity documents. Atrocity images, especially the rare ones that attest to acts of genocide, the crime of all crimes, offend and shame us. When we turn away from them, we promote ignorance. When we display them in museums without captions and download them from the internet with no historical context, we denigrate the victims. And when we stop researching them, we cease to care about historical justice, the threat of genocide, and the murdered missing. So there's some of the themes that I kind of close my book with. I wanted to just read that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I would finish with this idea that Wendy and I came up with last summer. We wrote this piece I mentioned for the TLS, and it was a review essay of Philippe Sand's excellent book, The Rat Line, and also David Marwell's biography of Joseph Mengele. And in both of them, we realized that they had got involved with their subjects, right? It was a personal journey for them. And we came up with this idea called the personal turn in terms of scholarship. And we thought our work conformed to this, the personal term. What does that mean exactly? Well, part of it means meeting your subjects, right? And just as Wendy went to Slovakia and interviewed the family of the photographer, and went to Michigan and interviewed someone who was potentially related to the victims. I was interviewing Bruno Lohse. I met him in 1998, as I said earlier, and over a 9-year period, I probably interviewed him 30 to 40 times would be the guess. I was on sabbatical in Munich in 2000, 2001 and lived a couple blocks away, and I saw him every 2 weeks. And some people will say, well, why would you talk to an old Nazi that frequently? And my answer is he was not prepared to divulge his secrets on first meeting, right? You have to build a relationship. You have to get to know one another. I asked him about that Pissarro picture every time I saw him from 2000 to 2006. He called it Das verdammte Pissarro Bild, the damn Pissarro picture. Are you going to ask me about that again? So it was, it was a personal journey trying to, get to Lohse's secrets. It was a game of cat and mouse. And so there was the personal element there. We also decided that the personal element usually involves personal documents. And when Lohse died, he left me his photographs and some of his papers. He had said he had planned to destroy them, and I remonstrated. I said, we have to preserve them. I'll give them to an archive. Don't destroy them. And so when he died, he did listen to me, to take care, and he gave them. This is Lohse at a banquet of the ERR, of the Nazi art plunderers. So think about it. It's wartime Paris, and people are starving, and Jews are being deported, and they have wine, and they have salmon, and they have silver. And so you get to see, I was talking about that up close and personal, to see his romantic life there. And he seems to be sticking this antenna in the nose of this woman. That was Lohse's way, I guess. This is an extraordinary photograph in his SS sweater with these two women and the bottle there too, right? And so, many of the documents are of a really personal nature, right? And I have to say, it also felt like a personal journey for me as well. 9 years and thinking of strategies and being on the hunt. And so there's an element, just as David Marwell had been an investigator to find out what happened with Temengala, and he had been on the commission that was doing the forensics, and he writes his own story into the book. So I write my story of meeting Lohse and peeling the onion. And I do want to say that it's also based on archival research. It's not so personal, perhaps, but just to assure researchers out there, there's still so many papers that have not been examined. In museums, it's the curatorial files. The museum archives tend to be open, though they're part of the Rousseau papers that are closed till 2073, right, for another 50 years there. But so getting to the curatorial files in museums has always been my hobby horse. And to write this book, I also found a little archive in Limoges. The archives, near Limoges, but LeBlanc is next door. And look at this archive. It's just this little podunk archive. There are Wendy came with me then, and we were the only ones in the archive for the week I was there, right? And so we're still finding new things that shed light on them as personalities, as people there, right? And this was really useful to me. But I think one of the elements of my book that's unique is the personal turn. That I met Lohse, interviewed him, and got his papers, and that's a feature of this book. So I think that's what I have.
Yeah. So maybe we should open it up for questions, right?
Yeah. May I, since I own the bookstore, maybe I could ask the first question. Seems only fair. This famous quote, "the banality of evil." I wondered, as you lived up close and personal, the evil acts of evil people, whether you found their actions banal, one, and two, how it affected you personally to be this close to such outrageous conduct.
You go first.
Well, the second part of that question is easier, because meeting Lohse was always an emotionally charged, a difficult event, right? The days I was going to see Lohse, I would wake up early, almost in a cold sweat, like something's going on today, right? And I would be preoccupied, and you'd go in to see him, and it wasn't just like you're having lunch with Maury. It's not Tuesdays with Maury's. You're seeing someone who's been involved in horrible crimes, and I was shaken by that, to be in his presence. He had a charisma to him. He had a kind of an aura to him. He was a big personality. He had a sense of humor, and he would laugh, and he was very engaging, but he had a temper too. When I saw him get angry, we talked about the memorial to murdered European Jews in Berlin, the Peter Eisenman Memorial, and he got so upset in the rage, and you could see this dark side of him. And so I always had the feeling that I was in the presence of someone evil, right? And someone who had done horrible things. And I approached him in that way. I felt I was doing investigative work. I took care. I couldn't take notes when I was with him because I thought I would constrain him and he wouldn't talk to me. But as soon as I left, I would jot down everything he had said. And I sent some of these notes to the FBI, to Interpol, to auction houses who were searching for work. So I definitely had a sense I was dealing with someone dark and dangerous. banal. It's a hard word to, I think historians now have decided that Hannah Arendt is great a political scientist. She was wrong on banality of evil with Eichmann, that he was not really banal. His language may have been banal when he testified in Jerusalem, but he was actually quite dynamic, and she's got to mischaracterize him. Lohse was also pretty dynamic too, right? He was 29 years old when he arrived in Paris. He was charming, impressing Goering. He was definitely very ambitious and very dynamic. So I don't know, the banal is harder, but Bert, you definitely picked on my sense of being in the presence of evil, and it was really, it was emotionally wrenching for me, actually.
Yeah, no, the banal theme, is not Eichmann in this case, but I think what she's trying to get at is that we don't demonize, we don't turn these monsters into non-humans in a way. And especially in the case of Eichmann, the way he really kind of tricked us all on trial, because the issue was his anti-Semitism. And so that was the conversation about, and it came out in the literature for a number of years, including in Chris Browning's work on Ordinary Men, how could these individuals engage in this massive genocidal campaign and feel, ambivalent about Jews, like they're just going through the motions and they're cogs in the wheel and all of that. So I found that in my interactions with in this case, perpetrators for research, collecting information, it was very unsettling, and it was exhausting, and you come home afterwards and you felt like you need to take a shower and just decompress and all of that. I was, first of all, fascinated though by the fact that the person I interviewed was such a time warp, that his entire atmosphere in his household and his language was so much of the time. While that was absolutely unpleasant, it was so important for me to see that and also hear it, because even in his utterances, I could get a sense of what the atmosphere was like at the time, how they would talk, like around the water cooler, and he would use metaphors and offhand remarks, and they made sense to me then when I went back to the documents, and I often read from documents to this perpetrator and challenged him and so forth. So we kind of could go back into this era, this period, and that's really, really important for analysis and for understanding the nuance and looking for the clues. A lot of the documentation is euphemistically language. It's very kind of cleansed or bureaucratic. So that's important. And that's the personal part of this as well, is trying to understand the depth of the human beings who are behind these operations, and that they seem like law-abiding, citizens, and you're having coffee with them, and sitting with them doesn't mean in any way that you condone or you apologize, but it's getting you closer to that history, and that gives you the chance to then come up with another explanation, find another clue, and understand it better, right? So I don't have a personal connection to the history as far as being a descendant of a victim or a perpetrator. So I have a kind of advantage and a privilege of going into this space scientifically and then, removing myself from it, right? It doesn't mean it's not difficult, but that helps. And everybody you talk to, is different. If I talk to Ukrainians, they have a different reason for giving me their testimony, in comparison to Jewish survivors. The hardest thing about being around the perpetrators was that they have no real motivation for, when they're talking to an historian, like getting at the truth of something. It is a cat and mouse, and you don't want to get caught up in that. Your endeavor is to get at what happened and the facts of what happened and who did what. And they want to play around with you. They don't want to quite give it all away, as Jonathan was saying. And that's the struggle. Whereas when you're with survivors, you're working on something together. You can hold each other's hands. You're trying to get to the bottom of something. You're trying to help, unpack a memory that's really difficult to unpack. So it's a completely different type of relationship and exchange, but in many ways, with the same aim historically. So
yeah, great question. Thanks.
Kelsey, would you tell us how, in the moments that remain, how someone could ask a question, and more importantly, how they can buy these books?
Absolutely. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can either raise your hand using the Zoom function, or just kindly and cautiously unmute You can also put it in the chat, as we've got a question from Jonathan, which I'll ask in a moment. But the more important thing here is getting these incredible books. So please, you can either drop us a line at chevaliersbooks@gmail.com. You can come, if you're comfortable, distantly shopping to our new location on Larchmont Boulevard, or you can find them via our bookshop site at chevaliers.com. You really can take your pick. And so now for some questions that are coming in, we've got one from Steve, and this is for you, Jonathan. Did Lohse ever express any regret or remorse?
Ooh, great question. Did Lohse ever express regret or remorse? Well, he expressed regret for the Holocaust. He said, in his own way, he said it was unnecessary. It should not have happened. That's as close as he came to expressing regret. He didn't deny the Holocaust. He didn't think it should be memorialized, as I indicated earlier. He questioned why I teach it, and we had some heated discussions about that. No, I mean, the closest he came is just to say that the Holocaust shouldn't have happened. I do recall him singing the Edith Piaf song in French, Je ne regrette rien, right? And I think that was more his motto, right? That he felt that he had he viewed the war as the most exciting time of his life. He was the king of Paris. It set him up for the rest of his life. The things that he embezzled and squirreled away, and I think that's the basis of his post-war wealth. And so I think I'm left with the image of Lohse singing Piaf there, and I don't think he was very regretful or remorseful. Great question.
Yeah.
Great. We've got another question that came in from Miriam in the time we have left. And this is for both Jonathan and Wendy. How can your research prevent genocides taking place in the present or prevent them moving ahead into the future?
Well, thank you for that question. My hope is, and when you say research, I've researched different facets of the Holocaust. I think, I wrote a book earlier on the women, Nazi women, Hitler's Furies, and I worked on diaries of Jewish victims and testimony work. This one is on this photograph. So I think it's all kinds of different activities and all kinds of research that are necessary because this act of research that is part of fighting against the forgetting, fighting against the erasure and the suppression. This photograph was not supposed to see the light of day. This the event that is pictured in the photograph was supposed to stay secret. It was supposed to stay in that little shtetl in Mariupol. It doesn't matter that it happened in broad daylight because the Nazis arrogantly assumed that a Ukrainian peasant would not be believed and that no one would believe this and they would leave no traces, and they went in and systematically tried to cover their crimes and cover their tracks. So when something like this comes out, this kind of a photograph, as shocking and disturbing as it is the reality. It is the fact of what can happen when hateful ideologies go to this extreme. It is an artifact of history. It is as well a warning as to what, where this can lead. So I, firmly believe that this kind of research is it's not just a kind of academic exercise, it's an ethical kind of obligation, when you come across a photo like this. There are some who believe that we shouldn't show such images, that they will desensitize us to this kind of violence over time. But I believe that, and I think that if you read my book, you will disagree. I think you'll realize that there's a lot of value to this kind of in-depth research. And I think it's a good exercise academically as well, and for readers to see that you can get to the bottom of something, that it takes a lot of, as Germans say, a lot of Sitzfleisch and a lot of determination as far as, the evidence. I didn't know when I started this in 2009 that we were going to be living in a post-factual society. So I feel like this is more important than ever. I kind of took it for granted. That's, in addition to all the other work we do as far as, policy making and the courts and the ICC and this in an academic way, this is my attempt to fight against the erasure of this history and to prevent it from happening again.
Yeah. Well, I certainly think there's an ethical component to my work. Our Nazi art plunderers, by and large, got away with it during the war and after the war, and so I'm holding them to account in the books, right? And my scholarship has practical application, as Bert Deixler knows, as an attorney. We worked on restitution cases, so I feel like I'm able to contribute to some healing in that regard. But in terms of the question about preventing genocide, I guess I would answer it this way. I've long argued that there's an inextricable link between the Holocaust and Nazi art plundering. Two of the elements are that taking away a people's cultural property is a way of dehumanizing them, of distancing them, right? And so that was really important. The art plundering began already in 1933, 6 years before the start of the war, and in Germany, right? And so whenever I see a people's cultural property being taken, that's a red flag. That's a signal that something dangerous is going to happen. The second element was that plundering showed the perpetrators that they could personally profit. Sorry, all the P's there, right? That plundering was profitable. And it was a kind of gateway drug for some of these perpetrators. First they plundered and then they killed. And there are reports of Lohse actually killing people too. So in the sense that we'll be more vigilant about art plundering. Sorry, those are snow plows out there. You may not have never heard those in California. We had a lot of snow here in Connecticut today. Snow plows outside. So I think, I'm very concerned about preventing the looting of cultural property. I'm actually pleased that the U.S. Army is actually in the process of creating a volunteer monuments men agency now. After World War II, the monuments men went out of business and we didn't have that. The U.S. Army was oblivious to art and cultural property for the last 70 years. So now they're going back and I think that's a good sign, a product of education. So the last thing I want to say, besides the practical application of my scholarship and this the importance of art plunder for the Holocaust, as I've talked about with our students, we see in both our works educated people putting their educations to work and using their education for nefarious means too. And so I talk with my students. I gave an address for the Phi Beta Kappa event a couple of years ago, and I said, don't use your great educations to do harm, to do terrible things. And that's what we see with Lohse, a PhD in art history, and we see how these educated people follow this path into darkness. And so I think by making these things evident to the students and on the surface, I think there's something positive about it.
Yeah.
So.
And in some ways, there's a relationship between our two books to the extent that in genocide studies, Lemkin, the man who coined the term genocide, in his original concept of it, he had delineated, kind of cultural barbarism, vandalism, and then the violence, so that part of his definitions as far as cultural destruction has only recently been kind of revived and studied in more detail. And because it led to the killing that we see in that photograph, that kind of overshadowed the fact that this escalation that leads to genocide and then coinciding with it is in fact this cultural destruction, erasure, and it's not something to be taken lightly. That's part of the campaign in the minds of the genocidaires, that the extermination and extinction is absolutely no remnant of that people, of that civilization. So when that starts, right? So some of the things that happened in Kristallnacht, November pogrom in 1938, of destroying synagogues, was obviously a warning sign that we have to take very seriously today, and not just jump to the photo that I showed you. That genocide is this killing moment. We have to stop it before we get to that point. And the cultural erasure part of it is certainly the path to that radicalization, that destruction.
Let me note that it is past 10 o'clock at Yale. And so, we don't want to keep you here until the middle of the night. So let me end by just saying how grateful I am for this evening, how grateful I am for these books, how important I think they are, how well written and thoughtful, and the product of the best of academia. You shed light on darkness, and I think we're all the better for it. So thank you very, very much for all that you've done.
Thank you, Bert. Thank you, Kelsey.
Yeah.
And thank you, Chevalier.
What a treat. What an honor. Yeah. And thank all of you for enduring this.
Yes. Buy those books. Buy those books. Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Bye.
More to
Thank
know.
you. Thanks, Bert.
Yeah.